They say life is full of surprises, but the greatest ones often come from the places you least expect. Thomas Holt had spent his life building his empire, his ranch stretching as far as the eye could see, each acre a testament to his hard work. But no amount of land, cattle, or wealth could fill the emptiness he felt inside. For all the riches he had, there was something missing, something he didn't even realize he was missing until she showed up. Clara Montgomery was not the woman he had imagined for himself. She wasn't the refined beauty, nor was she the one everyone expected him to marry. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, a resilience in her eyes that made him pause. She arrived, an outsider, seeking a fresh start, a woman abandoned by the world, much like he had once been. When Clara stepped off the train at Copper Creek, she wasn't greeted with warmth or smiles. Instead, she stood alone, waiting for a man she had never met, the letter she held clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She had come to marry a man she knew only by name, a man who, in that moment, was still a stranger. But Clara wasn't afraid. Life had taught her that fear was just another obstacle to overcome. As the station master handed her the letter with an indifferent glance, she could feel the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of, but it was the one she had chosen. She was ready to leave the past behind, even if it meant walking into the unknown. The world had rejected her, but she wasn't going to let that define her. Meanwhile, Thomas stood at his ranch, unaware of the storm that was about to change his life. He had made his peace with the idea of being alone, of never finding someone to share his heart with. The empire he had built was all he needed, or so he thought. But that all changed when Clara appeared, standing in front of him like an answer to a prayer he didn't know he had prayed. As she entered his world, everything shifted. His cold, lonely existence began to crack, piece by piece, and Clara, with her quiet grace, began to fill the spaces he didn't even know were empty. In the weeks that followed, Thomas found himself drawn to her. It wasn't the way she looked or the way she spoke. It was something deeper, something that reached into the very core of his being. She had a way of seeing him, not just as a rancher, not just as a man with power and money, but as a person. And that was something he had never experienced before. As Clara became part of his life, she unknowingly became the key to his empire, not by restoring the land or managing the business, but by restoring the man behind the empire. She had the ability to heal the wounds he had buried deep inside. She wasn't just the woman he married. She was the woman who would change everything for him, in ways he could never have imagined. As the days passed after Clara's arrival, something changed in the quiet rhythm of Thomas Holt's life. At first, it was small things. The way she moved around the house, making it feel less like a lonely fortress and more like a home. The sound of her boots echoing on the wooden floors, the soft clink of dishes as she set the table, and the warmth of the stove that had once been cold and unused. Thomas found himself watching her more than he intended, her quiet strength drawing him in, a force that was hard to ignore. Clara wasn't like the women he'd known before. Her beauty wasn't of the obvious sort, but there was something about her that made him notice, something in the way she carried herself, in the way she looked at him as though she saw past the surface. She didn't seem to want anything from him, not the wealth, not the land. She only asked for the space to be herself. But that, Thomas realized, was more than he had ever known to give. He had spent so many years focused on his ranch, on his empire, that he had forgotten what it meant to truly share a life with someone. Clara didn't ask for anything grand. She simply made sure the fire was always warm, that there was always a meal to share, that his home felt alive with the sound of someone else's presence. The change was subtle at first, but it was there, like the soft shift of seasons from cold to warm, from isolation to connection. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas sat across from Clara at the dinner table. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like two people who had finally found a rhythm after years of dancing alone. He noticed the way her hands moved, graceful despite the calluses, the quiet focus in her eyes as she sliced bread. She wasn't looking for attention, but somehow, she commanded it. He found himself thinking that perhaps, for the first time in a long while, he was truly seen. The thought startled him. He hadn't realized how much he longed to be seen, not for his land or his wealth, but for who he was underneath it all. It was a feeling he hadn't even known he was missing. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to notice more of the little things. Clara's smile when she'd pass him in the hall, the way she'd look out the window at the horizon as though she was making sense of something that was hard to grasp. They didn't speak about it directly, but Thomas could feel the weight of unspoken understanding between them. It was as if, without even trying, Clara had become a part of him, a part of his life that he couldn't imagine living without. The more time they spent together, the more he realized that Clara wasn't just the woman who had entered his life. She was the woman who had begun to heal him in ways he never thought possible. He had built his empire from the ground up, but it was Clara who had brought it to life, not with her hands, but with her heart. The realization hit him one evening when he found her standing in front of the fireplace, watching the flames dance. She was humming softly to herself, a quiet, peaceful tune that filled the room with an air of serenity. In that moment, Thomas understood that Clara was the key to his empire, not in the way he had first imagined, but in a deeper, more profound way. She was the one who had unlocked the parts of him he had locked away for so long. She was the one who had given his empire something it had never had, a soul. It wasn't the land or the cattle that defined him anymore. It was Clara and the love that had slowly blossomed between them. He could feel it growing, each day a new layer of connection, until it was undeniable. Clara wasn't just the woman he had married. She was the woman who had transformed his world, who had brought him back to life in a way he hadn't known he needed. Thomas Holt, the man who had once believed he needed no one, now found himself unable to imagine a life without her. As weeks turned into months, the small moments that had once seemed so insignificant began to mean something more to both Thomas and Clara. It wasn't just the way she prepared his meals, or how she'd make sure his boots were cleaned and ready for the next day's work. It wasn't the way she'd look out over the ranch, as if she could see the world in a way he never could. It was the way she made him feel, alive, seen, understood in ways he had never thought possible. There were mornings when Thomas would wake up early, the sun still low on the horizon, and find Clara already up, standing at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hands. She would look at him then, her expression soft, and without a word, she'd slide the cup toward him, silently offering peace in the quiet of the morning. Those small, quiet gestures spoke volumes, and each one dug deeper into his heart, making him realize more with each passing day how much she had come to mean to him. One afternoon, Thomas found himself walking across the property, his boots crunching against the dirt road, when he noticed Clara standing near the edge of the barn, staring out into the distance. The wind blew through her hair, and the light of the setting sun cast a warm glow on her face. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant, as though she was looking at something far beyond the ranch. It was then that Thomas realized just how much she had become a part of his world. He had thought he could live without anyone. He had thought he could keep his distance, protect his heart, and let his land be his only companion. But now, with Clara in his life, it felt like something had shifted, something had clicked into place. She had brought a light into his world that he never knew he needed. But there was more to Clara than he had yet to understand. There were moments when she would withdraw into herself, when her usual calm demeanor would give way to something deeper, something hidden. Thomas had noticed the way she would sometimes pause, as if lost in memories she couldn't quite reach, or how she'd look at the horizon with a wistful gaze, as if she were searching for something. It wasn't until one evening, as they sat in front of the fire, that Clara finally spoke of her past. "I wasn't always a woman without a family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas didn't know how to respond at first. He had never asked her about her past, never pushed her for details. But something in her voice, something in the way she said those words, made him want to listen, made him want to understand the woman who had silently changed his world. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the fire as she spoke. "I had a family once," she began. "A home, a life that seemed so certain. But that all changed, and I was left with nothing." Thomas didn't speak. He simply sat beside her, his gaze never leaving her face, offering her the space to share whatever she felt ready to reveal. She continued, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of the loss she had endured, the way her life had been upended by circumstances she had no control over. As she spoke, Thomas realized that Clara was not just the woman who had changed his world. She was also a woman who had known pain, who had suffered loss in a way that mirrored his own. And in that moment, He understood something more than just the love they were building. He understood that they were both broken in their own ways, but together, they had the power to heal. That night, as they sat in silence, Thomas reached out and took Clara's hand in his, a simple gesture that spoke louder than words ever could. He didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain more. They had both found something in each other, something that had been missing for far too long. They had found a way to heal, to rebuild, to build a life together. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of understanding, of shared experiences, and of the promise that, together, they could overcome whatever came their way. As the seasons changed, so did the relationship between Thomas and Clara. What had started as an arrangement, as something practical and necessary, had blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated. It was no longer about survival, not just about filling an empty space in their lives. There was something deeper now, a bond that had grown silently between them, woven through quiet moments and shared experiences. Thomas began to realize how much he had taken for granted before Clara came into his life. His empire, his vast ranch, the acres of land that stretched as far as the eye could see, none of it meant anything without someone to share it with. His loneliness had been masked by the demands of work, by the never-ending chores of ranch life. But now, with Clara by his side, he saw just how empty it had all been. Clara, too, had changed. She wasn't the same woman who had stepped off the train all those months ago. Back then, she had been cautious, unsure of what to expect, of what life would be like in this strange new place. But now, she moved with confidence, a quiet strength that came from knowing she had found a place where she belonged. The house, once cold and empty, now felt warm, full of life. There were still moments when the shadows of her past would creep in, when she would retreat into herself. But Thomas had learned to recognize these moments, to give her the space she needed without pressing for answers. They didn't need to speak about everything. There was a comfort in the silence they shared, in the way they could sit together, side by side, without saying a word and still feel completely understood. One evening, as Thomas sat on the porch, looking out at the setting sun, Clara came and joined him. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They had learned so much about each other in the months they had spent together, and yet, there was still so much to discover. The air was crisp, and the soft sounds of the evenings settled around them. The world outside seemed to pause, giving them a rare moment of peace. As the stars began to emerge in the sky, Clara turned to Thomas. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice soft but steady, "how we got here?" Thomas glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I think we were always meant to find each other," he said quietly. Clara looked at him, searching his eyes for something, perhaps reassurance or understanding, but what she found was a depth of feeling that mirrored her own. "I never thought I'd find peace like this," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "After everything, I didn't think I deserved it." Thomas reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his, offering her the comfort of his touch. "You deserve more than peace, Clara. You deserve to be seen, to be valued for who you are." Clara's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe them. She wasn't just the woman who had been left behind. She wasn't just the mail-order bride who had come to fill a need. She was someone who mattered. To Thomas, she mattered. The night stretched on, and the two of them sat together in the growing darkness, the weight of the world feeling lighter than it ever had before. In each other, they had found something they hadn't known they were searching for, a home, a family, and a love that had quietly woven itself into the fabric of their lives. The silence between them was no longer just a quiet void. It was a space filled with understanding, with the promise of tomorrow and the unspoken bond they had created, one day at a time. The months had passed in a quiet, steady rhythm, and Thomas found himself waking up every morning with a sense of calm he had never known before. The ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like a place of possibility, a place where the weight of the world wasn't so heavy anymore. Clara had woven herself into the fabric of his life, not by force, but by simply being there, by showing him a different way of living, a way that didn't revolve solely around work, wealth, and power. One chilly morning, as the wind whispered through the trees, Thomas found Clara standing outside, looking out at the horizon. She wasn't alone. Their dog, a scruffy mutt they had adopted from a nearby town, was sitting beside her, his tail wagging as if he too understood the significance of the moment. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the land. Clara turned to Thomas as he approached, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I was just thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about how much has changed since I got here." Thomas nodded, his hands slipping into his pockets as he joined her. "I think about it too," he said quietly. "I didn't know what I was missing until you came." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft but searching. "Do you think we've found what we were looking for?" she asked. Thomas thought about it for a moment, the silence stretching between them like an old friend. He thought about the nights he had spent alone, staring out at the stars, wishing for something more, something to fill the emptiness inside. And he realized, without a doubt, that what he had been looking for was right in front of him. "I don't know if I ever knew what I was looking for," he said slowly. "But now, with you here, I feel like I've found it." Clara smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. She didn't need anything more from him. She had found something in him too, a quiet strength, a sense of belonging that neither of them had known before. The world seemed to pause in that moment, as if giving them a chance to simply be together, to enjoy the peace they had found in each other. As the days passed, the bond between Thomas and Clara deepened. They worked side by side on the ranch, sharing the responsibilities and joys of running the land. Clara's presence had brought a new light to the ranch, not just in the way it looked, but in the way it felt. There was a warmth in the house now, a sense of home that had been missing for so long. Thomas often caught himself thinking about how lucky he was to have found her, to have been given the chance to build something real with someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. It wasn't just the work they did together that mattered. It was the way they supported each other, the way they had become a team. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas and Clara sat on the porch, the sun setting behind the mountains. The air was crisp, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. Clara rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, a sense of contentment settling over them both. "Do you think we'll always be like this?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. Thomas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I think we'll always be together," he said, his voice steady with certainty. "And that's all that matters." They sat there, watching the sky darken, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The quiet bond they had built was stronger than anything else in their lives, and for the first time in a long while, they felt like they had everything they needed, each other. It had been nearly a year since Clara had arrived at the ranch, and in that time, the bond between her and Thomas had grown stronger than either of them had anticipated. They had become not just partners in life, but in everything they did. The ranch had flourished under their shared care, and so had their relationship. Clara had found herself not just at home on the land, but in Thomas's heart as well. It was the kind of peace she never thought she'd experience, a peace she had only ever dreamed of. One evening, as the last light of day began to fade, Thomas sat at the edge of the porch, watching the stars slowly appear in the sky. Clara joined him, her presence as comforting as the steady rhythm of the wind that swept through the trees. She sat beside him, her hand brushing against his, a simple, quiet connection that spoke volumes. "It's hard to believe it's been a year," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the wind. Thomas glanced at her, his gaze soft. "Time seems to pass differently when you're not looking for something," he replied. Clara smiled, the warmth of it reaching her eyes. "I never knew what I was looking for," she said, "but I know now that I've found it." Thomas didn't say anything right away. He simply reached over and took her hand, holding it gently in his, a gesture that was as familiar as it was comforting. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds being the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional distant call of an animal in the night. There was no need for words between them. What they had shared in the past year spoke louder than anything they could say. The days of loneliness, of wondering if there was something more to life, seemed like a distant memory now. They had built something real, something worth holding on to. Clara looked out at the land that stretched before them. It was bathed in the soft light of the moon, the fields stretching out in a peaceful quiet. "I never imagined it would be like this," she said, her voice distant. though the contentment in her tone was unmistakable. "I never imagined I would find peace like this." Thomas followed her gaze, his eyes resting on the land they had worked so hard to restore. "I didn't think I needed peace," he said, "but now I know it's the one thing I've always wanted." Clara turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "We've both been through so much," she said quietly, "but somehow we've found this." Thomas nodded, his grip tightening slightly on her hand. "We've found each other," he said, his voice steady with certainty. "And that's enough." The stars above twinkled as if in agreement, their quiet brilliance echoing the peace that had settled in their hearts. There was no rush, no need to hurry. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he had everything he needed. It wasn't the land, the cattle, or the wealth he had accumulated. It was Clara. She had changed everything for him, not by fixing what was broken, but by making him realize that what mattered most was what they had built together. Together, they had created something more lasting than anything money could buy. They had created a home, a life filled with meaning, with each other at its center. Clara rested her head on his shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to make promises for the future. The future was already unfolding before them, slowly and steadily, like the gentle night that surrounded them. And in that silence, in that shared space, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it. Together. It was early spring when Thomas began to realize that the peace he had found with Clara was more than just a passing season. The ranch, which had once felt like a burden, now felt alive with promise. Every corner of the land, every barn and fence, seemed to echo the quiet strength that Clara had brought into his life. Together, they had built something real, something that had weathered the storms of their pasts. The land was growing, and so was their love. One afternoon, as the sun sat high in the sky, Clara was working in the garden, her hands moving gracefully as she tended to the plants. Thomas watched her from the porch, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't the first time he had found himself watching her with a sense of awe, but it was the first time he understood fully what she had brought to his life. He had always thought that power came from wealth, from owning land, from being in control. But now, he saw that true strength came from something else, something he had never known until Clara had shown him. It came from the heart, from the quiet moments spent together, from the way she had made him see the world differently. He walked down the steps of the porch, his boots heavy against the earth, and approached her. She looked up, her eyes soft with the same warmth that had filled their home. "How's the garden?" he asked, his voice gentle. Clara smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It's growing," she said, "just like everything else around here." Thomas stood next to her, watching as she carefully placed another seedling into the soil. The work had always been hard, but with her by his side, it didn't feel like work anymore. It felt like something they were building together, something they could both be proud of. "I don't think I ever told you," Thomas began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet sincerity. Clara paused, looking up at him with a curious expression. "What's that?" she asked, her voice soft. "How much you've changed things here," Thomas said, glancing around at the thriving garden and the land beyond. "I used to think that having everything, money, land, was all I needed. But now, I see it wasn't. It was never about that." Clara's eyes softened, and she reached out, touching his arm gently. "It's not about what you have," she said, her voice filled with a wisdom that had become so familiar to him. "It's about who you share it with." Thomas looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He had always believed he had everything he needed. But now, he realized that it had always been her. She had filled the spaces in his life that he hadn't even known were empty. "I've never been good at showing my feelings," Thomas admitted, his gaze steady but filled with vulnerability. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful. For everything." Clara smiled, a warm, reassuring smile that made his heart ache with love. "I know," she said simply. They stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the soft hum of the world around them filling the silence. There was no need for more words. What they had between them was stronger than anything that could be said. Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Clara worked side by side, building their life together. The ranch flourished, and so did their love. The nights were filled with shared laughter, and the days with quiet companionship. Thomas knew now that there was nothing more he could want. He had found peace, not in the land, but in Clara, and that was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Their love was a quiet, steady force, one that had been built slowly, but had grown stronger with every passing day. And for the first time in his life, Thomas Holt felt whole, not because of his wealth or his land, but because of the woman standing beside him, the woman who had made him realize that the true riches of life were the ones that couldn't be measured in acres or dollars. They were measured in love, in moments shared, and in the strength of the bond they had built together. The days turned into weeks, and the steady rhythm of life at the ranch continued, but Thomas and Clara both knew that change was always on the horizon. It was not the kind of change that came with a storm or a sudden shift in the land. It was the kind of change that came slowly, like the growth of a tree, one branch at a time. It was the change that happened when two people learned not just how to live together, but how to thrive together. It was in the way Thomas found himself looking forward to the quiet evenings with Clara, when they would sit on the porch together, watching the stars appear in the sky, their hands intertwined, the world around them falling into a peaceful hush. Clara, too, had found her place in the world. She no longer felt like a stranger in a foreign land. The ranch had become her home, just as much as it had become Thomas's. There were still moments when the past crept in, when the weight of old memories tried to settle on her shoulders, but she had learned how to let them go, how to allow herself to be part of something new, something brighter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land, Clara sat by the window, a book in her lap. She had grown to love the quiet of the evenings, the soft light that filtered through the trees, and the sense of peace that settled over everything. Thomas entered the room, wiping his hands on his work shirt, his face showing the tiredness of the day, but also the satisfaction of a job well done. He looked at Clara, his gaze softening. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low, "about how much this place has changed." Clara looked up from her book, her eyes meeting his. "It has changed," she agreed. "But not just the land. We've changed too." Thomas walked over to her, sitting down beside her on the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, comfortable in the silence, knowing that the space between them had become a place of understanding, of connection. "I don't think I ever realized how much I needed this," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I needed you. I needed us." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. She had never been one to seek out grand declarations, but there was something in his voice, in the way he spoke, that made her feel seen, made her feel that she had finally found the place where she belonged. "I needed you too," Clara said softly, her hand reaching out to touch his. "We've both found something here. Together." Thomas nodded, his hand, finding hers and holding it gently. "Together," he repeated. They sat there for a while, the quiet of the evening wrapping around them like a blanket, the stars beginning to twinkle above them. There was no need for words, no need for explanations. The understanding between them was enough. As the days passed, their bond only grew stronger. They worked side by side, day in and day out, each of them learning new things about the land, about each other, and about themselves. Thomas found that his days were no longer defined by the work he did or the things he had, but by the moments he shared with Clara. It wasn't the cattle or the crops that made him feel fulfilled anymore. It was the way she looked at him when he came home at the end of the day, the way she laughed when he teased her, the way her hand felt in his. And Clara, too, found that the world had become a place of endless possibility. She had come to this ranch seeking a new start, but she had found so much more. She had found love, companionship, and a home. A life that was real, a life that was hers, one that she had built with Thomas, piece by piece. As the seasons continued to change, Thomas and Clara knew that they had created something that couldn't be measured in acres or cattle. They had built a life, a love, and a future together. And in that, they had found everything they had been searching for. The seasons had begun to shift once again, and with it came new changes in the rhythm of life at the ranch. The summer sun was starting to set earlier, casting long shadows across the fields as Thomas and Clara worked together, each task feeling more natural than the last. There was an ease between them now, a quiet understanding that flowed like the steady rhythm of the creek that ran through the property. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on just how far they had come. When Clara had first arrived, he had no idea that she would become the center of his world, But now, the thought of life without her was unimaginable. Every corner of the ranch, every sunrise, every quiet evening on the porch felt incomplete without her beside him. It was a realization that had crept up on him slowly, but it was clear now. He was in love with her. Clara, too, had begun to notice how much she had changed in the time she had spent at the ranch. The woman who had arrived, uncertain and alone, had transformed into someone who felt grounded, who felt that she had finally found her place. It wasn't just the land she had come to love, it was the life she had built with Thomas. It was the laughter they shared, the quiet moments of understanding, and the comfort of knowing that she was no longer alone in the world. She had come to understand that love didn't need to be grand or loud. It could be quiet and steady, just like the bond they had forged. One evening, as they sat together in the barn, sorting through the hay for the winter months, Clara looked up at Thomas, her expression soft but serious. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady, "about what comes next." Thomas paused, looking at her with a hint of curiosity. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice calm, though a part of him wondered if she was planning to leave. But Clara shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I mean, about the future. About what we can build here, together." Thomas's heart swelled at her words. He had never doubted their future, but hearing her speak about it so openly made the idea seem even more real, more tangible. He moved closer to her, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers. "We've built a lot already," he said quietly. "But if you want more, Clara, we'll build it. Whatever you need, whatever you want, I'll be right here beside you." Clara's eyes softened, and for a moment, the world outside the barn seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, together in that space, the future unfolding in the quiet certainty of their love. "I've never had someone like you in my life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never felt so safe, so sure." Thomas's heart skipped a beat, and he gently lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "You're my home, Clara," he said, his voice steady with sincerity. "I always have been, and I always will be." They stayed there for a while, their hands entwined, sharing the silence that had become so comfortable between them. The days ahead no longer seemed uncertain. They had built something together, something strong and steady, something that would stand the test of time. As they looked to the future, neither of them could say exactly what it would bring, but they knew one thing for sure. Whatever came, they would face it together. And that, in itself, was enough. As the seasons continued to change, so did the life that Thomas and Clara had carefully built together. The summer days slowly melted into the cool embrace of autumn, and the ranch, which had been a symbol of hard work and perseverance, now felt like a home filled with warmth and laughter. The simple rhythm of their days, working side by side, became something neither of them ever took for granted. The land, once just a means of survival, now held memories of shared triumphs and small victories. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara leaned against Thomas, the quiet comfort of his presence grounding her in a way she had never known before. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked softly, her eyes searching the horizon. Thomas was silent for a moment, the weight of her question settling between them. He had often thought about the life he had before Clara, the life that was filled with work and solitude, but he had never felt the emptiness quite as he did now. "I used to think about it all the time," he said, his voice steady. "But not anymore. I don't think I could go back to a life without you." Clara smiled, a small, knowing smile. She understood. They had both changed in ways they never expected. The quiet moments, the laughter shared in the kitchen, the long days spent working the land. These were the things that had become their new reality, and it was enough. "I don't think I could go back either," Clara admitted, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "I found something here. Something I didn't know I was looking for." Thomas turned to her, his eyes softening as he looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "And what's that?" he asked, his voice low. Clara took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "A future, a life, a place where I'm not just surviving, but living." The simplicity of her words struck a chord deep within him. They had both come to this place in search of something different, something more than what they had before, and in the process, they had found each other. Thomas reached for her hand, his grip firm yet tender. I never thought I could have a life like this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm grateful. More than you know. Clara's heart swelled at his words. She had never needed grand gestures or elaborate promises. What she had found with Thomas was enough. It was real. It was theirs. The days went by slowly, but they were content. With each passing season, they found new ways to grow, not just as individuals, but as a couple. The ranch became more than just a place to live. It was a place where dreams were built, where futures were shaped, and where love grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Clara turned to Thomas, her eyes reflecting the quiet certainty she had found in him. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and curiosity. Thomas looked at her, his face soft with affection. "We've done more than enough," he said with a smile. "We've built a life. Together. And that's more than most people ever get." Clara smiled, her heart full as she reached for his hand. The wind gently rustled the leaves in the trees, and for a moment, everything felt right in the world. Together, they had found something precious, something lasting. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. And in that moment, surrounded by the land they had nurtured together, they both knew that they had already built everything they had ever needed. The autumn air had a crispness to it as the ranch settled into a peaceful routine. The harvest was in full swing, and the land, which had been nurtured by both Thomas and Clara, was now yielding its rewards. The once barren fields were full of life, and the barn was filled with the bounty of their hard work. It was the first year they had seen such a successful harvest, and it was a reminder of just how far they had come. The days were still long, but now they were spent in the company of each other, working side by side, not just as husband and wife, but as equals, partners in every sense of the word. Clara had never imagined that life could be this fulfilling. She had come to this ranch hoping for a fresh start, a place to rebuild, but she had found so much more. She had found not just a home, but a family, not just a man, but a partner who understood her in ways she never thought possible. And now, with every passing day, she found herself growing more deeply in love with Thomas. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Clara paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow. She glanced over at Thomas, who was kneeling in the dirt, carefully tending to the plants. The soft sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow on his face. And for a moment, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. She had found peace here, in this quiet life they had built together. It wasn't a life of grand gestures or dramatic moments, but it was enough. Thomas, too, had found something he hadn't known he was missing. When Clara had first arrived, he had been focused on the ranch, on the work that needed to be done, on the empire he had built. But now, he realized that it wasn't the land, or the wealth, or the cattle that defined him. It was the love he shared with Clara, the companionship, the quiet moments spent together, that made his life complete. As he looked up from his work, he caught Clara's gaze, and a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly, his voice low but filled with warmth. Clara's smile was gentle as she knelt beside him, brushing a few strands of hair behind her ear. "I was just thinking about how lucky I am," she said, her voice steady with emotion. "I never knew that life could be like this. I never thought I could find a place where I truly belong." Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his. "You belong here, with me," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "We've built something special together, Clara. Something I never imagined I could have." Clara's heart swelled at his words, and she squeezed his hand gently. The love between them had grown in quiet ways, in small gestures and shared moments. It wasn't something they needed to speak of all the time, but it was there, in everything they did. The quiet mornings, the laughter over dinner, the nights spent on the porch watching the stars. These were the things that had come to mean everything to her. As the evening drew near and the sky began to darken, Thomas and Clara sat on the porch, their chairs side by side. The cool breeze ruffled the leaves of the trees, and the sounds of the night began to fill the air. Clara rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, her heart at ease. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked quietly. Thomas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer. "I don't think about the future the way I used to," he said. "I used to worry about what I had to do, what I needed to build, what I needed to achieve. But now, I just think about what we have. And I know that's enough. Clara smiled softly, her eyes closing as she relaxed into his embrace. It is enough, she agreed. Together, they sat there in the quiet of the evening, content in the life they had built, and ready for whatever the future might bring. They had found their home, not in the land, but in each other. And that was more than they had ever hoped for. As the winter months settled over the ranch, a quiet stillness filled the air. The snow had started to fall softly, covering the land in a blanket of white, and the world outside seemed to slow down. The ranch, which had seen so much growth and change over the past year, now stood in peaceful silence, its usual bustle replaced by the calm of the season. Thomas and Clara had spent the last few days preparing for the winter, gathering firewood, and making sure the barn was stocked with everything they would need. The hard work of the season was behind them now, and all that remained was the quiet, comforting routine of daily life. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Clara sat by the window, gazing out at the snow falling softly from the sky. Thomas sat across from her, a book in his lap, but his attention was on her, as it often was these days. There was something about the way the firelight danced on her face, something that made her look even more beautiful than she already was. It was a beauty that came not just from her appearance, but from the quiet strength she radiated, the way she had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. Clara turned to him, sensing his gaze. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly, her voice a gentle melody in the stillness of the room. Thomas set the book aside and leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving her. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. "I never imagined my life would be like this. I thought I knew what I wanted, what I needed, but I didn't. Not until you came into my life." Clara smiled, her heart swelling at his words. She had never expected this life, never imagined that she would find peace, love, and fulfillment in a place so far from where she had started. "I didn't expect this either," she admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "I came here looking for a fresh start, but I found so much more." Thomas stood and crossed the room, sitting down beside her. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "You changed everything for me, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what it meant to truly be happy, to truly be at peace, until you were here." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. She had always known that their bond was special, but hearing him say it so plainly, so openly, made her realize just how much their lives had intertwined. They had built something together, something that was deeper than anything she had ever known. "And you've changed everything for me," Clara said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity. "You've shown me that I can be more than just someone who survives. I can live, really live." Thomas smiled, squeezing her hand. "We've both found something here," he said, his voice steady with the truth of it. "We've built a life, together, and that's something I wouldn't trade for anything." Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, and for a moment, they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of each other's presence filling the space between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, they had everything they needed. The future was uncertain, as it always would be, but in that moment, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The quiet love they shared was enough to carry them through anything, and that was more than either of them had ever hoped for. As the night stretched on and the fire burned low, they sat together in the peaceful stillness, knowing that their journey was just beginning, but it was one they would walk hand in hand, through every season, together. The winter had passed, and with it came the promise of new beginnings. The snow that had once blanketed the land had melted away, giving way to the first signs of spring. The earth began to thaw, and the once barren fields slowly started to show signs of life. The trees, stripped of their leaves, now began to bud with the soft green of new growth. It was a time of renewal, of rebirth, and Thomas and Clara both felt it in their hearts. The ranch, which had seen so much change, now felt like a place of endless possibilities. They had worked side by side to build it into something they could both be proud of. The land had flourished, and so had their love. Every day, they found new ways to grow together, to deepen their connection, and to make their dreams a reality. One morning, as the sun began to rise, Thomas and Clara stood at the edge of the fields, looking out at the land before them. The sky was painted with the soft hues of dawn, and the air was crisp with the promise of a new day. Thomas turned to Clara, his gaze soft and full of affection. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, his voice quiet but filled with warmth. Clara smiled, the soft glow of the morning light catching in her eyes. "We have," she agreed. "I never imagined this life. I never imagined I'd find so much here." Thomas reached for her hand, his fingers brushing gently against hers. "I never imagined I'd find someone like you," he said, his voice steady with sincerity. "You've changed everything for me, Clara." Clara's heart swelled at his words. She had never expected her life to turn out this way, to find love in such a quiet, unexpected place. But now, with Thomas by her side, she knew she had found everything she had ever wanted. Together, they had created a life that was more than just about survival. It was about living, truly living, and sharing that life with someone who cared as much as they did. As they stood there, hand in hand, watching the sun rise over the land they had worked so hard to make their own, Clara knew that the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to look forward to, something they would build together, step by step. "Whatever comes next," Clara said softly, "we'll face it together." Thomas nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet determination. "Together," he repeated. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. And for the first time in a long while, Thomas and Clara knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already created something that would stand the test of time, a love that was as strong as the land they had cultivated together. As the seasons changed, so would their love, growing and evolving with each passing day, but always rooted in the quiet strength they had built together. They had found their home, and now they had found their future. And in each other's arms, they knew that no matter what came their way, they would always have a place to return to, a place to call their own.